An American soldier went missing in France in 1944, vanishing into fog-covered woods during a routine patrol, never to be seen again. For 79 years, his disappearance haunted his fiancée, his unit, and an entire village that chose silence over truth. But when a forgotten barn was torn open by a historian's shovel, an old Leica camera was unearthed, its film still intact. What developed wasn't just photographs, but a chilling eyewitness account of betrayal, execution, and a secret so dangerous it had been sealed beneath stone for decades. The images exposed not only who killed him, but why powerful people across 2 countries ensured he stayed missing. And now, as the last frame reveals a hand reaching for the lens, one question remains. Who wanted this story buried, and who made sure it would rise again? Dawn crept over the French countryside like a hesitant visitor, painting the November sky in washes of pale gray. A thick blanket of mist clung to the rolling hills surrounding Oradour-sur-Vézère, transforming familiar shapes into ghostly silhouettes. The air held the sharp bite of approaching winter, carrying the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Private First Class Raymond Fletcher stood at the edge of the American camp, methodically checking his gear. His hands, calloused from months of war, moved with practiced efficiency over his equipment: ammunition pouches, canteen, field rations, compass. The weight of his Leica camera hung carefully around his neck offered a familiar comfort. It was a beautiful piece of German engineering he'd traded 3 cartons of cigarettes and his mother's fruitcake for, worth every crumb. The camp stirred behind him with the quiet routines of morning. Coffee cups clinked against mess kits, and low voices carried through the fog. But Ray's attention remained fixed on his preparation, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The mission ahead required focus. Allied intelligence had reported unusual German activity along the ridge 2 miles north, and command wanted eyes on the ground before committing more resources to the area. "Hey, Fletcher!" Corporal James Hines appeared beside him, steam rising from a tin cup of coffee clutched in his hands. His face bore the stubble of several days without a proper shave, and dark circles shadowed his eyes, testament to another night of fitful sleep in the field. "Morning, Jim." Ray adjusted the strap of his helmet, checking its fit one final time. "Visibility's for shit out there," Hines said, gesturing toward the wall of fog with his cup. "Lieutenant says we got reports of German stragglers in the area, probably just farmers spreading tales, but—" He let the warning hang in the air. Ray nodded, patting the holster at his hip. "Got the old friend right here if needed." The weight of his M1911 pistol was reassuring, though he hoped it wouldn't be necessary. His job was to observe and report, not engage. "Just keep your head down," Hines said. "These woods have been quiet lately, maybe too quiet." He took a long sip of coffee, grimacing at either the taste or the thought. "And don't forget your radio check-in at noon." "Yes, Mother," Ray replied with a slight smile, but his eyes remained serious. They'd lost too many friends to carelessness. "I'll be back before you finish that sorry excuse for coffee." Hines snorted and clapped him on the shoulder. "Better be. It's your turn to dig the latrine tonight, and I ain't covering for you again." Ray shouldered his pack and took a final look at his map in the strengthening dawn light. His route was simple enough. Follow the old logging trail northwest until it intersected with a seasonal creek, then track northeast along the ridgeline. The terrain wasn't particularly challenging, but the fog would make navigation tricky. The forest swallowed him within 50 yards of camp. Moisture beaded on his uniform and equipment as he moved through the mist, his boots making little sound on the carpet of wet leaves. The Leica bounced gently against his chest with each step, and occasionally he paused to capture an image that caught his eye. Morning light filtering through bare branches, abandoned farm equipment slowly being reclaimed by nature, the geometric precision of shell craters slowly filling with autumn rain. Photography had become his way of processing the war. Where other soldiers wrote letters or kept journals, Ray documented the world through his viewfinder. Sometimes beauty, sometimes horror, but always truth. His father, editor of the Stillwater Gazette back home, had taught him that a photograph could speak volumes more than words. The logging trail gradually deteriorated as he climbed higher into the hills. Here and there, Ray noticed fresh boot prints in the mud, too crisp to be more than a day old. He photographed them methodically, noting their direction and approximate size in his small notebook. The fog began to thin as the morning advanced, revealing more of the surrounding forest. Something caught his eye, an unusual marking carved into the trunk of a massive oak tree. Ray approached carefully, camera already raised. The symbol appeared to be some sort of runic design, cut deep into the bark with practiced precision. He'd seen similar markings near German positions before, usually associated with SS units. The wood around the carving was still pale, indicating it was recent work. Click. The camera's shutter captured the image. Ray made a careful note of the tree's location on his map. Command would want to know about this. He'd seen enough evidence of German activity to justify continuing his patrol, but every instinct urged caution. The woods felt wrong somehow, too still, too watching. He pressed on, moving more slowly now, stopping frequently to listen and observe. The ridgeline loomed ahead through breaks in the trees, and as he climbed, more signs of recent activity emerged. Cigarette butts of German manufacture, a discarded ration tin, boot prints leading toward what appeared to be an old farmstead tucked into a fold of the hill. The building was a substantial stone structure, typical of the region, with a collapsed section of roof and a large barn attached to one side. It didn't appear on his map, which was unusual for a building this size. Ray documented the exterior methodically, moving in a careful circle to capture every angle. Signs of recent occupation were subtle but present. Fresh mud tracked across the threshold, a faint tendril of smoke staining the air above the chimney. Click. Click. The camera recorded everything. Ray checked his watch. 11:45 a.m. Almost time for his radio check-in. He found a sheltered position with a clear view of the farmhouse and pulled out his radio handset, but before he could key the microphone, movement caught his eye. A figure emerged from behind the barn, tall, wearing what appeared to be a German officer's greatcoat. Click. The camera captured the moment automatically, Ray's photographer's instincts operating independent of conscious thought. His heart pounded as he raised the camera again, trying to get a clearer shot of the officer's face. But something was wrong. The figure moved with an unnatural stillness, and even at this distance, something about its proportions seemed off. Click. Ray's hands were steady, but sweat had begun to bead on his forehead despite the November chill. The officer turned, seeming to look directly at Ray's position. He raised his hands slowly, showing he was unarmed, but his mind was racing. If he ran now, gunfire would give away the Allied position. If he surrendered, there was a chance to learn what the Germans were doing here, so close to American lines. Click. One final photo as the officer approached. The camera captured what Ray's mind struggled to process. Details that didn't quite add up, a face that didn't quite match any human expression he'd ever seen. His finger moved toward the radio's transmit button, but a gloved hand reached for his camera first. The woods fell silent again, disturbed only by the quiet flutter of falling leaves. Back at camp, the day stretched into afternoon without word from Ray. His noon check-in came and went. By 1400 hours, Lieutenant Parker had organized the first search party. They found nothing but muddy boot prints that vanished mysteriously halfway up the ridge. More men went out as darkness approached, calling Ray's name into the gathering gloom. Their voices echoed unanswered through the hills. Flares cast brief, harsh light over the empty forest, but the woods kept their silence. As night fell fully, the searching soldiers returned one by one to the main camp. A small fire burned at the center of their position, its flames reflecting off tired, worried faces. Ray's spare rations sat untouched near his empty tent. Lieutenant Parker stood apart from the others, staring into the darkness beyond the firelight. He'd lost men before, all of them had, but something about this felt different, wrong. Fletcher was too experienced, too careful for a simple patrol to go this badly. He knew better than to go quiet, someone muttered near the fire. No one disagreed. The lieutenant gathered Ray's rations with slow, deliberate movements. Each man watched in silence as he stored them away, the simple action carrying the weight of grim ceremony. Tomorrow there would be more searches, more reports to file, more questions without answers. But tonight, they could only wait and wonder, and try not to think about what might be hiding in the fog-shrouded hills. The fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows across faces that had seen too much war to believe in simple explanations anymore. Each man kept his thoughts to himself, but they all felt it, the creeping certainty that whatever had happened to Ray Fletcher was something their official reports would never truly capture. Dawn crept over the camp on November 13th with the consistency of wet cement. A steady drizzle had fallen throughout the night, turning the forest floor into a treacherous maze of mud and slick leaves. Lieutenant Parker stood at the edge of the command tent, watching as 3 local French guides approached with their tracking dogs. The animals' breath steamed in the cold morning air. Corporal Daniel Hines adjusted his rifle strap, studying the faces of the French guides. They were weathered men, farmers mostly, who knew these woods better than any map could show. The oldest among them, a man called Marcel with deep-set eyes and tobacco-stained fingers, spoke quietly with the lieutenant through an interpreter. "The rain makes tracking difficult," Marcel explained, gesturing at the sodden ground, "but the dogs, they can still find something if there's anything to find." Lieutenant Parker nodded, unfolding a map across a wooden crate. The search teams would split into 4 groups, each taking a quadrant extending from Ray's last known position. Hines made sure he was assigned to the team heading toward the ridge where Ray had disappeared. He hadn't slept much, kept awake by the memory of their last conversation, just a casual, "see you at chow," that now felt weighted with significance. The dogs picked up a scent almost immediately, leading them along what remained of Ray's original patrol route. Hines recognized landmarks from previous searches: the lightning-struck oak, the cluster of shell holes, the fallen telephone pole. But in the morning light, with the dog's excited barking echoing through the trees, everything felt different, more ominous. Marcel's dog suddenly veered off the logging trail, pulling hard toward a dense thicket. The group followed, ducking under wet branches. There, pressed into a patch of relatively sheltered ground, they found fresh boot prints. Hines knelt to examine them, his heart pounding. "These are his," he said quietly. "Size matches, and see this wear pattern on the heel? Ray had a habit of walking heavy on his right side. He didn't mention that he recognized this because they'd trained together, shared foxholes, compared worn-out boots after long marches. The tracks led them northeast, toward a steep ravine that cut through the forest like an axe wound. The dogs followed eagerly at first, but as they approached the ravine's edge, their behavior changed. They began whining, pulling back against their leashes, ears flat against their heads. "Something spooked them," Marcel observed, trying to calm his dog. "This is not normal." The tracks continued right to the ravine's edge, then simply stopped. No signs of sliding down the steep slope, no indication of which direction Ray might have gone, just abrupt absence, as if he'd vanished into thin air. Hines felt cold. That had nothing to do with the November weather. Lieutenant Parker ordered a thorough search of the ravine and surrounding area. They found nothing: no blood, no torn fabric, no signs of struggle. Just empty forest and the constant drip of water from the trees. Around midday, word came from another search team. A farmer tending his withered grapevines claimed he'd seen someone matching Ray's description near an old vineyard barn maybe 2 days ago. The man had been walking purposefully, the farmer said, as if he knew where he was going. Hope flared briefly as they double-timed it to the location. The barn was a solid stone structure with a slate roof, typical of the region's agricultural buildings. But as soon as they approached, Hines knew it was another dead end. The heavy wooden door hadn't been opened in weeks, evidenced by the undisturbed leaves piled against it. Inside, empty wine barrels gathered dust. Sunlight filtering through cracks in the roof illuminated nothing but ancient farming tools and cobwebs. "Could have been someone else," the lieutenant said quietly. "A lot of American uniforms in these woods these days." But something about the farmer's story bothered Hines. He'd mentioned specific details about the uniform, the way the man carried himself. Details that seemed too precise for a casual observation. When pressed, the farmer became evasive, his French more broken, his gestures more exaggerated. Marcel pulled Lieutenant Parker aside, speaking in low tones. Hines caught fragments of the translation. "Some people in these parts," and "during the occupation," and "not everyone fought against the Germans." The lieutenant's face hardened. "We're here to find our man, not start witch hunts about collaboration. There's no proof of anything else. Clear?" The message was understood. The war was complex enough without adding local politics to the mix. Still, Hines noticed how some of the French guides wouldn't meet the farmer's eyes as they left. There were currents here deeper than military maps could show. The search continued until dusk made it impossible to see tracks or signs. They returned to camp empty-handed, mud-covered, and silent. The dogs, usually eager workers, seemed relieved to be leaving the forest behind. That evening, Hines sat alone in the tent he'd shared with Ray, facing the impossible task of packing away his friend's life. Ray's footlocker contained the usual soldier's possessions: spare socks, ammunition, chocolate bars from home, letters from his fiancée Margaret. Everything was organized with typical Ray precision. At the bottom of the footlocker, Hines found a half-written letter. The paper was slightly crumpled, as if Ray had been interrupted while writing. "Dearest Margaret, the leaves here remind me of autumn back home. Though everything else is different, I keep taking pictures. You'd laugh at how I waste film on ordinary things. But sometimes it's the ordinary moments that need remembering most. Yesterday, I photographed two kids playing marbles in the ruins of their house like the war wasn't even happening. That's the kind of thing that gives you hope, you know? I can't write much about where we are or what we're doing, but I promise I'm being careful. The guys watch out for each other here, especially Daniel. Corporal Hines, remember I wrote about him? He's probably the best friend I've made in this mess. The kind of friend you'd want to introduce to your family after. The letter ended there. Hines read it 3 times, each word cutting deeper than the last. With careful movements, he folded the paper and slipped it into his coat pocket. He couldn't bring himself to add it to the official collection of effects that would be sent home. Outside, the sounds of war continued. Distant artillery fire rumbled like phantom thunder. Trucks moved along the supply lines. Orders were shouted, missions planned, the vast machinery of combat grinding forward. The 94th Infantry Division had a war to fight, and one missing scout couldn't stop the advance. But in that quiet tent, Corporal Daniel Hines sat with his hands pressed against his eyes, surrounded by the ordinary possessions of a friend who had walked into the fog and never returned. Tomorrow, they would continue the search. Tomorrow, there would be reports to file and positions to defend. Tomorrow, the war would demand their full attention again. For now, though, he allowed himself this moment of grief, watched over by the silent witnesses of Ray's belongings, the worn boots by the tent flap, the carefully folded uniform on his cot, and the empty camera case that had never left his side. The telegram arrived on a Tuesday morning, carried through knee-deep snow by Jimmy Peterson, the postmaster's son. Margaret watched from the kitchen window as the boy struggled up the driveway, his red scarf whipping in the January wind. She knew before opening the door, mothers and sweethearts across America had learned to recognize that particular walk, the hesitant approach of someone bearing news they wished they didn't have to deliver. "Miss Holloway," Jimmy said, his mittened hand trembling slightly as he held out the yellow envelope. He didn't meet her eyes. Margaret stood in the doorway, letting the cold air bite at her bare arms. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fresh bread. She'd been baking that morning, trying to keep her hands busy. Now those same hands felt numb as she took the telegram. "We regret to inform you that PFC Raymond J. Fletcher has been reported missing in action. Stop. Last known location, Oradour-sur-Vézère, France. Stop. Further information will be forwarded as it becomes available. Stop." The words blurred together. Margaret read them 3 times, each pass making less sense than the last. Missing wasn't dead. Missing meant there was still hope. Missing meant they just hadn't found him yet. "Miss Holloway?" Jimmy was still there, shifting from foot to foot in the snow. Do you need me to get someone?" "No," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "Thank you, Jimmy. Tell your mother I'll bring by that pie recipe she asked for tomorrow." She closed the door before he could respond, pressing her forehead against the cold wood. Behind her, the kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. The bread in the oven was starting to burn. That afternoon, Margaret walked the 3 miles to the Fletcher family farm, the telegram folded carefully in her coat pocket. The wind had picked up, driving loose snow across the fields in white sheets. Ray's mother answered the door, took one look at Margaret's face, and understood. "Oh, no," Mrs. Fletcher whispered. "No, please." They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Ray had proposed to Margaret 18 months earlier, laying out his mother's ring between the sugar bowl and the butter dish. Mr. Fletcher stood by the window, his back rigid, staring out at the barren fields where his son had learned to drive a tractor, where he'd taught him to use a camera. "Missing isn't dead," Margaret said firmly, spreading the telegram on the table between cups of cooling coffee. "They'll find him. You know Ray. He's careful, smart." Ray's sister Jenny, barely 13, clutched a postcard Ray had sent her from basic training. "He promised to be home for my birthday," she said. "In April. He promised." Mrs. Fletcher reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. Neither of them mentioned how many missing soldiers never came home, how many families lived in this terrible limbo of uncertainty. Instead, they talked about Ray's letters, his photographs, the way he could find beauty in the smallest things. That evening, Margaret sat at her desk and began to write. Her first letter went to the War Department. "Dear Sir, I am writing regarding PFC Raymond J. Fletcher, service number 376444821, reported missing in action near Oradour-sur-Vézère, France. I understand you must have many such inquiries, but any additional information about the circumstances of his disappearance would be deeply appreciated. She wrote to the Red Cross next. To whom it may concern, I am seeking information about American soldiers currently held in German POW camps. My fiancé, PFC Raymond Fletcher, was reported missing in November 1944. The letters to Ray's commanding officer were harder to write. She rewrote them several times, trying to strike the right balance between urgency and respect. Lieutenant Parker, you may not remember me, but I am Ray Fletcher's fiancé. He mentioned you often in his letters, speaking highly of your leadership. I know you must be busy with the ongoing operations, but if you could spare a moment to share any details about Ray's last known movements. Weeks passed. The responses, when they came, were polite but unhelpful. The War Department acknowledged her inquiry and promised to update her if new information emerged. The Red Cross had no record of Ray in any known POW camps. Lieutenant Parker's letter was kind but vague, offering condolences while saying nothing concrete about what might have happened. Margaret kept writing. She contacted French resistance groups, international aid organizations, even the Vatican's prisoner location service. Each letter she sent felt like a stone dropped into a deep well. She could only hope it would eventually hit bottom. February brought more snow and more silence. Margaret visited the Fletchers every Sunday after church, sharing what little news she had. Jenny had pinned Ray's postcard above her bed, next to a calendar where she marked off the days until April. Mrs. Fletcher moved through the house like a ghost, touching Ray's things. His high school diploma on the wall, his camera case in the study, the sweater he'd left draped over a kitchen chair. Mr. Fletcher threw himself into farm work, spending long hours in the barn even though there was little to do in winter. One afternoon, Margaret found him sitting on an upturned feed bucket, holding Ray's old baseball glove. He was always taking pictures of the oddest things, Mr. Fletcher said without looking up. Spent a whole roll of film once just shooting raindrops on spider webs. Said sometimes you had to look real close to see what matters. Margaret nodded, remembering the photographs Ray had sent her. Not just the usual soldier poses, but quiet moments. A French child's toy abandoned in a doorway, morning fog lifting off a river, his buddies sharing coffee and cigarettes in the pre-dawn light. He's out there somewhere, she said, taking pictures of things we'll never understand until he shows us. March came in like a lion, howling around the eaves and rattling windows. Margaret's letters continued, each one more desperate than the last. She began including photographs of Ray, as if putting a face to the service number might make someone search harder. The local newspaper ran a small piece about Ray's MIA status. Neighbors brought casseroles and offered prayers. Margaret accepted both with quiet grace, but inside she felt like screaming. Everyone spoke about Ray in the past tense now, as if missing had somehow transformed into something more final while she wasn't looking. One evening, after another day of no news, Margaret drove through the storm to St. Michael's Church. The heavy wooden doors creaked as she entered the empty nave. Her footsteps echoed on the stone floor as she made her way to the bank of votive candles near the altar. She lit one carefully, watching the small flame catch and steady. In its light, she could almost see Ray's face, not as he appeared in his last photograph, serious in his uniform, but as she remembered him from that summer before he shipped out. They'd spent an entire afternoon by the lake, and he'd shown her how to use his camera, laughing as she accidentally took 3 pictures of her own thumb. "Please come home," she whispered to the flame. "Just, please come home." Outside, thunder rolled across the prairie. The storm was gathering strength, but Margaret stayed in the church, watching her candle burn among dozens of others, each one a prayer, a hope, a plea for someone's safe return. In the flickering light, she could almost believe that somewhere, somehow, Ray was looking back through his camera lens, capturing one more moment worth remembering. The brown envelope arrived on a Wednesday in April 1948, tucked between a seed catalog and a letter from Margaret's sister in Milwaukee. The return address bore the familiar letterhead of the Department of the Army, Washington, D.C. Margaret recognized the precise typeface, the official seal. She'd seen enough of these over the past 4 years to know their weight before opening them. She set it on her kitchen counter and went about her day, teaching 4th grade arithmetic, helping Mrs. Peterson in the school library, walking home past blooming lilac bushes that reminded her of the corsage Ray had given her at his sister Jenny's confirmation. The envelope waited. Thursday came and went, then Friday. The envelope gathered dust beside her mother's china sugar bowl. On Saturday morning, Margaret cleaned her small house on Cedar Street, working around the unopened letter as if it were a sleeping creature best left undisturbed. By Sunday, her neighbor Alice Hopkins noticed something was wrong. She brought over a rhubarb pie after church. "That envelope's still sealed, Margaret," Alice said gently, watching her friend pour coffee into mismatched cups. "Would you like me to?" "No." Margaret's hands were steady as she set down the coffee pot. "I know what it says. They're changing his status from missing in action to presumed dead. The war's been over 3 years. They need to close the books." Alice reached across the table, but Margaret pulled back, busying herself with pie plates and forks. The ticking of the kitchen clock filled the silence between them. "I saw Jenny Fletcher yesterday," Alice tried again. "She mentioned the new memorial at the VFW post. The dedication's next Saturday." Margaret nodded, her movements mechanical as she served the pie. She'd seen them installing the granite monument last month, a solemn gray obelisk inscribed with the names of local boys who never came home. She'd walked past it every morning on her way to school, careful not to look too closely at the partially covered names being carved into its face. "His parents are going," Alice added softly. "They'd like you to be there." Margaret stared down at her untouched pie. The rhubarb's tartness seemed to rise from the plate, mixing with the memory of another spring day, another pie she'd baked for Ray before he shipped out. He'd teased her about the too thick crust, but ate 3 pieces anyway. "I'll think about it," she said. After Alice left, Margaret finally picked up the envelope. The paper was thick, official, carrying the weight of bureaucratic finality. Inside would be a death certificate with a blank space where a date should be, a form letter expressing regrets, perhaps another medal to add to the Purple Heart that had arrived in 1945. She carried it upstairs to her bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of her dresser. Inside lay a wooden box that had once held Ray's camera equipment. Now it held his letters, 87 of them, bundled in faded ribbon, along with newspaper clippings, his basic training photograph, and the instruction manual for his beloved Leica camera. She placed the unopened envelope on top and closed the drawer. That night she corrected papers at her desk, red pencil moving efficiently across multiplication tables and fraction problems. In the margin of Tommy Anderson's homework, she noticed he'd drawn a small airplane. It looked like the ones in Ray's last letter, sketched beside his description of watching Allied bombers pass overhead. She gave Tommy full marks anyway. The week crawled by. Margaret taught her lessons, attended church choir practice, helped plant the school's victory garden that no one had the heart to rename. On Saturday morning, she put on her navy blue dress, the one Ray had said matched her eyes, and walked to the VFW post on Main Street. The crowd was already gathering when she arrived. Women in their best hats, men with American Legion pins on their lapels, children fidgeting in starched collars and Sunday shoes. The granite monument stood draped in a large American flag, waiting. Margaret found the Fletchers near the front. Jenny, now 17 and nearly as tall as her mother, hugged Margaret tightly. Mrs. Fletcher's hair had gone completely gray, but her grip was strong when she took Margaret's hand. Mr. Fletcher nodded silently, his face weathered as old leather. The ceremony began with the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by speeches from the mayor and the VFW post commander. Margaret let the words wash over her. Duty, sacrifice, eternal gratitude. When they pulled away the flag, sunlight caught the freshly carved names. Her eyes found Ray's immediately. PFC Raymond J. Fletcher, 1920-1944. Missing in action. A woman Margaret didn't recognize touched her arm. "I'm Helen Winters," she said quietly. "My Tom's up there too. Normandy." Margaret nodded. She remembered the telegram about Tom Winters, just 3 weeks after D-Day. "The first year's the hardest," Helen continued. "Then you start to find ways to live around the hole they left. Eventually you learn to carry it." "It's been 4 years," Margaret said. "But you haven't let him go yet, have you?" Helen's eyes were kind but knowing. Sometimes acceptance is the only peace we get. Margaret watched as people began placing flowers at the base of the monument. Jenny laid a small bouquet of lilacs, Ray's favorite. The sweet scent drifted up, mixing with the spring air. "I can't accept what I don't understand," Margaret said. Finally. Ray wasn't reckless. He wouldn't just vanish into thin air. Something happened out there in those woods, something nobody's found yet. Helen squeezed her arm once more before moving away. Other people came by, old teachers, former classmates, parents of students. Margaret thanked them automatically, barely registering their words of comfort. Her eyes kept returning to Ray's name, the crisp edges of the letters that tried to sum up 24 years of life and 3 years of searching. The ceremony ended with taps, the mournful notes floating across the town square. People began to drift away, back to their Saturday routines. Margaret stayed, watching shadows lengthen across the granite face. Mr. Fletcher was the last to leave. He paused beside her, looking up at his son's name. "Ray used to say a photograph isn't just about what you can see," he said roughly. "It's about what's just outside the frame, waiting to be discovered." Margaret walked home slowly, her shoes clicking against the sidewalk. The spring evening was settling in, bringing with it the smell of fresh grass and distant rain. She thought about Helen's words about acceptance, about Mr. Fletcher's memory of Ray's photography philosophy. Upstairs, she opened her dresser drawer and took out the wooden box. The unopened envelope was still on top. Beneath it, she found the Leica instruction manual, dog-eared and covered with Ray's neat margin notes. His letters were next, the paper soft from repeated reading. She returned everything to the box, even the unopened envelope, and slid it under her bed. Some stories didn't end with stone monuments or official certificates. Some truths waited in silence like undeveloped film. That night she dreamed of Ray. He was standing in a forest she didn't recognize, morning mist swirling around his boots. His camera hung around his neck, and he was reaching out toward something she couldn't see. Before she could call his name, he faded into the fog, leaving only the sound of distant thunder and the faint click of a shutter. Margaret woke to rain tapping against her window. The dream clung to her like cobwebs, both familiar and strange. She'd dreamed of Ray before, but never like this, never with such clarity, such a sense of something unfinished. The barn's weathered doors groaned as Marcel Dubois pushed them open, sending pigeons scattering into the gray February sky. His leather shoes, polished to a mirror shine, sank slightly into the decades of hay and dirt coating the floor. Behind him, his wife Catherine wrinkled her nose at the musty air. "C'est parfait," Marcel declared, his voice echoing in the empty space. "We'll clear it all out, replace the roof. Think of the parties we could host here, ma chérie." The real estate agent, Monsieur Girard, shifted uncomfortably. He was a local man, old enough to remember what this barn had been during the occupation. But the Dubois family came from Paris with deep pockets and deeper political connections. No one wanted to discourage their investment in the recovering region. "The structure is sound," Girard offered carefully. "The previous owner maintained it well before the war." Marcel strode across the barn, his footsteps hollow against the wooden floors. "And this trapdoor?" he asked, pointing to the heavy iron ring barely visible beneath scattered straw. "A wine cellar, perhaps?" Girard's face tightened. "The cellar was sealed in 45, the limestone. It's not stable down there." The lie came easily after 4 years of practice. Previous owner filled it with concrete for safety. Catherine, still lingering by the entrance, called out in her cultured Parisian accent, "Marcel, darling, let's discuss the main house instead. The barn can wait." Marcel nodded, already sketching renovation plans in his mind. Within minutes, the small group had moved on, leaving the barn to its shadows and secrets. Through the broken windows, wind stirred the hay covering that iron ring, and the limestone blocks beneath it that had never been meant for storage. In Minnesota, summer heat pressed against the windows of Margaret's small apartment above Anderson's drugstore. She sat at her vanity, studying her reflection as Ellen Patterson, soon to be her maid of honor, pinned the borrowed veil into her hair. "There," Ellen said, stepping back. "Now you look like a proper bride." Margaret touched the delicate lace, remembering another veil she'd once tried on at Pearson's department store. Ray had caught her wearing it and pretended to faint from her beauty, making the shop girls giggle. That veil had stayed in the shop window, waiting for a wedding that never came. "Jim's a good man," Ellen said softly, reading her friend's expression. "He understands." Margaret nodded. James Morrison was a good man, quiet, steady, a fellow teacher who never pushed her to talk about the past. He knew about Ray, had seen the photograph she kept on her nightstand. "The heart's big enough for both," he'd told her when he proposed. "The living and the remembered." She opened her jewelry box, removing a small velvet pouch. Inside was her grandmother's pearl necklace, something old. The veil was borrowed, her dress new, for something blue. Her hands found the wooden box beneath her bed without looking. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, lay Ray's last letter, the envelope tinted pale blue. She wouldn't wear it, but having it nearby felt right. The paper was soft from countless readings. The ink faded where her fingers had traced his words. Ellen pretended not to notice as Margaret slipped the letter into her handbag. Some ghosts were meant to be carried gently. The wedding was small but lovely, held in the same church where Margaret had once lit candles for Ray. Jim's hands were steady as he placed the ring on her finger. His kiss was warm and real. At the reception, people commented on how happy she looked, how wonderful it was to see her, smiling again. Later that night, in their new house on Maple Street, Margaret carefully unpacked her belongings. Jim was downstairs, giving her space for this private ritual. The photograph of Ray went on her nightstand, as agreed. The box of letters found a home in her bottom drawer, beside her teaching certificates and graduation photos. But there was one last thing to do. At her small writing desk, Margaret composed a final letter to Pierre Dumont, the French liaison who had helped search for Ray in the years after the war. Her handwriting was neat, controlled. Dear Monsieur Dumont, I hope this letter finds you well. I write to inquire if any new remains have been discovered in the Oradour-sur-Vézère region during recent reconstruction efforts. I understand that such searches are no longer active, but perhaps... She paused, ink bleeding slightly where her pen hesitated. After 5 years, the words came harder. What was there left to ask? Perhaps something has been found that was overlooked before. Any information, no matter how small, would be deeply appreciated. Sincerely, Margaret Holloway Morrison. She sealed the envelope quickly, before doubt could stop her. The morning would bring a new life as Mrs. Morrison. But tonight, she was still partly that girl who had watched Ray march away, carrying his camera and promises of return. The reply came 3 weeks later, tucked between a utility bill and a catalog. The envelope was thin, never a good sign. Margaret waited until evening to open it, after Jim had gone to his bowling league. Monsieur Dumont's response was polite but brief. No new remains had been located in the area. Recovery efforts had largely ceased as France focused on rebuilding. He expressed sympathy but suggested gently that perhaps it was time to find peace in uncertainty. Margaret folded the letter carefully and added it to the box. Outside, autumn painted the trees in flames of red and gold. Soon, winter would come again, bringing with it the anniversary of Ray's disappearance. But this year would be different. She pressed a hand to her stomach, feeling the first subtle swell beneath her dress. The baby, her baby, would arrive in spring, when the lilacs Ray had loved were in bloom. Jim wanted to name it Raymond if it was a boy, but Margaret had declined. Some names carried too much weight. December 1950. Snow fell in thick, lazy flakes outside the nursery window as Margaret rocked her daughter Diana. The baby's eyes were heavy with sleep, but her tiny fingers still clutched at her mother's sweater. Softly, barely above a whisper, Margaret began to hum. The melody was one she hadn't sung in years, a lullaby Ray had recorded for his young niece before shipping out. The tape had worn out long ago, but the tune remained, a ghost of comfort in the quiet room. Sweet and low, wind of the western sea. Diana's grip loosened as sleep finally claimed her. Margaret continued rocking, watching the snow gather on the windowsill. It was the heavy, insulating kind that muffled all sound, the same as that night in France when footprints had vanished and silence had swallowed a soldier whole. But tonight, the silence held different promises. Of first steps and scraped knees, of school plays and graduation days, of a future unfolding like clean white pages, waiting to be filled. Margaret laid Diana in her crib, tucking the hand-knitted blanket around her sleeping form. The snow outside grew thicker, erasing the boundaries between earth and sky. Somewhere in France, an old barn creaked under its own blanket of white, keeping its secrets for another winter. The morning sun cast long shadows through the fog as Henri Lemoine's Peugeot wound its way up the narrow road to Oradour-sur-Vézère. His silver hair caught the light as he consulted the wrinkled property deed on the passenger seat. After 40 years of studying history, he was finally going to preserve a piece of it. The farmhouse appeared through the mist like a forgotten photograph, weathered stone walls, a sagging roof, and windows that hadn't reflected light in decades. Henri parked in what had once been a courtyard, his tires crunching on gravel and dead leaves. The spring air carried the musty sweetness of wet earth and aging wood. "Monsieur Lemoine," a voice called out, "the historian from Limoges?" A small group of villagers had gathered at the property line. Their spokesman was an elderly man leaning on a wooden cane, his face lined like a topographical map. Yes, that's me. Henri grabbed his briefcase and approached them with a warm smile. I'm here to begin the renovation survey. The old man, who introduced himself as Marcel Dubois, nodded gravely. We heard you bought the Girard place at auction, planning to turn it into some kind of museum? That's right, a small one, focusing on local wartime history. Henri gestured toward the building. The location is perfect, and the original structures are largely intact. A murmur passed through the group. Marcel's grip tightened on his cane. Some things are better left in the past, monsieur. This land, it has memories. Bad ones. The war touched everywhere, Henri said gently. But that's why we preserve these sites. To remember. No. A woman in the back spoke up. Her gray hair was pulled into a severe bun. This place is different. It's cursed by the war. Ask anyone. Henri fought the urge to roll his eyes. He'd encountered similar superstitions at other historical sites, rural folklore born from trauma and time. I appreciate your concern, but I assure you, the Girards never prospered here, Marcel interrupted. Their crops failed, livestock died, their children moved away, even the birds avoid nesting in those trees. He pointed to the skeletal branches overhanging the barn. Henri maintained his professional smile. I'm sure there are perfectly rational explanations for the silence, the woman with the bun cut in. You'll notice it soon, how nothing echoes right, how the air feels heavy. Others nodded in agreement. Well, Henri said, clearing his throat, I should start my initial survey. Thank you for the welcome. He turned toward the house, then paused. Oh, if any of you have photographs or documents from the war years, I'd be very interested in making copies for the museum. The villagers exchanged glances. Marcel shook his head slowly. No one kept records from those days, monsieur. Some memories are better burned. They dispersed like smoke, leaving Henri alone with his purchase. He watched them go, noting how none looked back at the property. Superstition was a powerful force in rural France, he reminded himself. These people had grown up in the shadow of occupation, their childhood playgrounds marked by violence. Of course, they'd created darker meanings for abandoned places. Still, as he approached the farmhouse, Henri couldn't shake the feeling that the morning mist clung too thickly here, that his footsteps fell too quietly on the dead grass. He pulled out his phone to check the time and frowned at the lack of signal. The screen showed only static. The main house was a typical French farmstead, 2 stories of local stone with blue shutters now faded to gray. Henri had seen the interior photos from the auction listing, but standing before it now, he noticed details the camera had missed. Peculiar marks around the window frames, as if something had been repeatedly nailed up and torn down. A pattern of deep scratches on the front door, too regular to be random damage. He made notes in his journal, then circled around to the barn. This structure interested him more. Its architecture suggested pre-war construction, meaning it might have been standing during the occupation. The huge wooden doors hung askew on rusted hinges. Inside, morning light filtered through holes in the roof, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Henri set up his equipment, a folding table for his laptop, a professional-grade metal detector, and various measuring tools. He'd learned from experience to start with a systematic survey before any renovation work began. Old farms often held surprising artifacts just below the surface. The metal detector's first pass yielded expected results: nails, pieces of farm equipment, the occasional coin. But when he reached the back corner, near where the floor had partially collapsed, the detector's signal strengthened significantly. Henri marked the spot with a flag and continued his sweep. By noon, he had identified several areas of interest, all clustered around the same corner. He was photographing the pattern when a truck pulled up outside. Monsieur Lemoine? A stocky man in work clothes appeared in the doorway. I'm Pierre Rousseau, the carpenter you hired, here to look at the floor supports. Ah, yes, perfect timing. Henri showed him the collapsed section. What do you make of this? Pierre knelt, running calloused fingers along the exposed beams. Wrought in the support posts, but strange. He frowned. These stones underneath, they're not foundation. Look how they're fitted together. This was added later. When? Late 40s, maybe early 50s. See these marks? Pierre pointed to chisel scars on the limestone blocks. They sealed up something down there. Old cellar, probably. Henri's historian instincts tingled. The property records don't mention a cellar. Not surprised. Lots of places sealed up their underground spaces after the war. Some held supplies for the resistance. Others... Pierre shrugged. Well, better not to know what they held. Henri made another note. Could we open it safely? The floor needs replacing anyway, but it'll take time to remove these blocks properly. They're mortared tight. Someone wanted this sealed permanent. Start with the rotted sections, Henri decided. I'll do some careful excavation around the edges, see what we find. Pierre nodded but didn't move immediately. You know what they say about this place? The curse? Henri smiled. I've heard. My grandfather helped build that stone seal. Pierre's voice dropped. Said they worked at night, no lights allowed. Said the owner paid triple his normal rate, in gold. He stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. Just be careful what you dig up, monsieur. Some things stay buried for a reason. After Pierre left to get his tools, Henri began clearing debris from around the collapsed section. The work was methodical, meditative. Each layer he removed felt like turning a page in history. Fragments of rural life accumulated over decades. A rusty horseshoe, a broken bottle from the 1960s, a bent fork with an ornate handle. Then his trowel clinked against something metallic. Heart quickening, Henri brushed away more dirt. A brass button emerged, then another. Military issue by the look of them. Nearby, he found several corroded ammunition casings. Interesting, he muttered, bagging the items carefully. The presence of military artifacts wasn't surprising. The entire region had seen heavy fighting during the liberation. But something about their placement, buried beneath intentionally sealed stones, raised questions. The afternoon passed in careful excavation. Henri worked inward from the collapse, documenting each find. The metal detector's signal grew stronger as he went deeper, centered on a point just beyond his reach. He was considering whether to risk widening the hole when his phone chimed, a timer reminding him of dinner plans in town. Henri packed his equipment reluctantly, leaving one lamp set up to illuminate the dig site. He'd return later to secure the barn for the night. As he drove to the village restaurant, his mind kept returning to that strengthening signal, to the mysteries still buried beneath those carefully placed stones. The meal passed quickly, a simple cassoulet and half-bottle of local wine. Henri found himself rushing through it, eager to return to his work. The sun was setting as he pulled back into the farmhouse courtyard, casting long shadows through the trees that seemed to point toward the barn, like accusing fingers. Inside, his lamp cast a lonely pool of light around the excavation. The evening air had grown heavy with moisture, and somewhere in the distance, thunder growled. Henri knelt beside the hole, shining his flashlight into the darkness. That's when he heard it. A subtle shift of stone against stone, like settling weight or shifting earth. The sound seemed to come from below, from behind the sealed blocks. Henri held his breath, listening. Silence stretched out, broken only by the first drops of rain hitting the roof. Then, there, another soft scraping sound. Henri adjusted his position, bringing the flashlight closer to a hairline crack between the limestone blocks. The beam caught something in the darkness beyond, a glint of metal, dull but distinct. He shifted slightly, trying to get a better angle. The light reflected off a flat surface, rectangular, roughly the size of a shoebox. As his eyes adjusted, Henri could make out more details: olive drab paint, stenciled lettering, a distinctive lid design, a military ammunition box perfectly preserved in its stone tomb. The rain intensified, drumming against the barn's roof. Henri remained frozen, flashlight beam fixed on that telltale glimmer of metal. In his mind, questions multiplied like echoes. Why had someone sealed this away so carefully? What else lay hidden beneath these stones? And most importantly, what secrets had he just discovered? Henri's hands trembled as he knelt beside the excavated hole in the barn floor, early morning light streaming through the gaps in the roof. The ammo box sat before him, its olive drab surface dulled by decades underground. He'd waited until first light to begin, wanting proper documentation of everything. His camera sat ready on a tripod, and he'd laid out clean cloths and archival gloves. The box itself was remarkably intact. The military-grade seal had protected its contents from moisture and decay. Still, Henri moved with practiced caution, his historian's training taking over as he photographed the box from every angle before attempting to open it. The latch resisted at first, groaning with corrosion. Henri applied gentle pressure, not wanting to damage anything inside. With a metallic crack that echoed through the empty barn, the lid finally gave way. The musty smell of old fabric hit him first. Beneath a layer of disintegrating waterproof canvas, he found a carefully folded sleeve from an American military uniform. The patch was faded, but still recognizable. The crossed sword insignia of a U.S. infantry division. Henri lifted it delicately, photographing both sides before setting it aside. Underneath lay 3 dog tags, their chains tangled together. The green-tinged metal had corroded, but the stamped letters remained legible. Henri squinted at the first tag, his breath catching as he made out the information. Fletcher Raymond J. 374259991, T430 no preference. The other tags bore different names, equally corroded. Henri documented each one meticulously, his mind already racing with possibilities. These weren't discarded items. They'd been deliberately preserved, hidden away with care. But it was the final item that made his heart skip. Wrapped in what appeared to be a wool sock was a Leica 3 camera, its black leather case weathered but intact. Henri recognized the model immediately. He'd seen similar ones in war museums. This was a professional-grade camera, the kind used by military photographers and war correspondents. "Mon Dieu," he whispered, carefully lifting it from its makeshift cocoon. The camera felt solid, substantial in his hands. Even after all these years, the mechanical precision of German engineering was evident. But why had it been hidden here, sealed away with such determination? Henri's fingers itched to open the camera back to see if any film remained inside. But his training prevailed. This was now a historical artifact, possibly evidence. He needed to follow proper protocols. With hands that shook slightly, he pulled out his phone and dialed the local gendarmerie. "This is Henri Lemoine at the old Orador farmhouse," he said when they answered. "I found something you need to see." The next hours passed in a blur of official activity. 2 gendarmes arrived first, followed by a representative from the Ministry of Defense's Historical Division. They photographed everything in situ, carefully bagged and tagged each item, and took Henri's detailed statement about the discovery. "This is significant," said Lieutenant Dubois, the ministry representative, as she examined the dog tags. "We don't often find items this well preserved, especially with clear identification." "What happens now?" Henri asked, watching as they prepared to transport the artifacts. "Standard procedure is to notify the American authorities through proper channels," Dubois explained. "Given the historical nature of the find, the American Battle Monuments Commission will be involved. They maintain records of all U.S. personnel missing in action from World War II. By afternoon, word had spread through the village. A reporter from La Montagne, the regional newspaper, showed up with a photographer. Henri gave a brief interview, carefully avoiding speculation about the item's origins. The story would run the next day under the headline, "Wabu Relics Found in Forgotten Barn." But Henri couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this story. That evening, after the officials had gone, he sat in his study researching the name from the dog tags. PFC Raymond Fletcher had been reported missing in November 1944, just months before the war's end. His unit had been operating in this very region, helping clear out pockets of German resistance. The camera particularly haunted Henri's thoughts. If it had belonged to Fletcher, it might contain more than just photographs. It might hold answers about his fate. But ordinary photo labs wouldn't have the expertise to handle such delicate historical material. After several hours of research and phone calls, Henri found what he needed. A specialized restoration laboratory in Paris that had experience with wartime photographic equipment. They agreed to examine the camera, but insisted it be delivered in person due to its fragile nature. The next morning, Henri began the 4-hour drive to Paris, the carefully packed camera secure in a padded case beside him. The autumn countryside rolled past his window, gentle hills and small villages that had witnessed the war's passing nearly 8 decades ago. He thought about Fletcher, a young American who had traveled these same roads in much darker times. The drive gave Henri time to think, to piece together the puzzle's edges. The careful preservation of the items suggested intention, not accident. Someone had deliberately hidden these things rather than returning them to proper authorities. But why? What had Fletcher seen or documented that warranted such secrecy? The restoration lab occupied the top floor of an old building in the 11th arrondissement. Inside, the space smelled of chemicals and old paper. Claire Duray, the lead technician, greeted Henri with professional curiosity. "Let's see what you've brought us," she said, leading him to a workstation equipped with specialized lighting and magnification equipment. Under the harsh examination lights, the camera's worn surface revealed its age. Claire handled it with reverent care, examining each component through her magnifier. "Remarkable condition, considering," she murmured. "The seals held well. The mechanisms appear. She paused, adjusting her lens. Monsieur Lemoine, there's something you should see. Henri leaned in as she adjusted the light. Through her magnifier, he could see what had caught her attention. The film advance lever was partially engaged. The film's still inside, Claire whispered, her voice carrying a hint of awe. Henri's heart pounded against his ribs. He thought of Fletcher, the young soldier with his camera, documenting something on that long-ago November day. Whatever he had seen, whatever truth he had captured on that film, had remained locked in darkness for nearly 80 years. Now, in this brightly lit lab, those images might finally emerge into the light. The restoration lab's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Henri climbed the narrow stairs to the 3rd floor. 3 weeks had passed since he'd first brought in Ray Fletcher's camera, and Claire's updates had been cautiously optimistic. Today would reveal if anything remained of those long-buried images. The lab occupied what had once been an artist's studio, with tall windows now covered by light-blocking curtains. Claire met him at the door, her dark curls pulled back tight, wearing a white lab coat and protective gloves. Monsieur Lemoine, she greeted him with a slight nod. Come, I'll show you our setup. She led him past rows of specialized equipment to a sealed workspace that resembled a darkroom merged with a medical lab. 3 separate stations held different chemical baths, their contents giving off a sharp clinical smell. An infrared scanner occupied one corner, its display showing ghostly patterns of decay across a film negative. We have to work in stages, Claire explained, gesturing to each station. First, we stabilize what remains of the emulsion layer. Then we use a combination of chemical restoration and digital scanning to retrieve any surviving silver halide particles. She pointed to a sealed chamber. The film is too fragile to handle normally. Even the slightest touch could destroy what's left. Henri peered through the chamber's observation window. Inside, strips of brownish film floated in a pale solution. And the chances of success? Claire's expression remained carefully neutral. Film doesn't survive war or time, monsieur, especially not both. We've managed to extract partial images from World War II film before, but... She shrugged. Usually they're just shadows, hints of what was there. She led him to a computer workstation where preliminary scans filled the screen. We started with the most intact roll first. The results were surprising. The first image slowly resolved on screen. A group of American soldiers sharing cigarettes beside a half-track vehicle. Though faded and spotted with age, their faces were remarkably clear. Young men grinning at the camera, their uniforms dusty but their spirits apparently high. These are just the initial scans, Claire said, clicking through more photos. Street scenes, civilians, military vehicles. Your soldier had a good eye for composition. Look how he framed this shot of children beside the tank. See how the late afternoon light catches their faces? Henri leaned closer. The photos showed the war from an intimate perspective. French villagers offering wine to tired GIs, a soldier helping an old woman carry water buckets, a candid shot of men playing cards by lamplight. Ray Fletcher had captured not just the conflict, but the human moments between battles. The second roll was similar, Claire continued, pulling up another set of images. More military subjects. Supply convoys, damaged buildings, troop movements. But the third roll... She hesitated, her hand hovering over the keyboard. The third roll was different. The timestamp on the final roll read November 11th, 1944, the day Fletcher disappeared. The first few frames showed forest paths in early morning mist, tree branches heavy with autumn leaves. Then came an image that made Henri's breath catch. A strange circular symbol carved deep into an oak tree's bark. We enhanced this one specifically, Claire said quietly, zooming in on the carving. It appears to be some kind of runic symbol. Our researchers identified it as possibly connected to SS Totenkopf units. They sometimes used occult imagery. The next frame showed a partial face, probably Fletcher himself caught in reflection, looking over his shoulder. Even through decades of degradation, the anxiety in his expression was clear. Claire clicked forward. A blurred figure in a German officer's greatcoat appeared to be emerging from what looked like a cellar entrance. The image was grainy, the figure's face obscured, but the military bearing was unmistakable. The next photo struck like a physical blow. Ray Fletcher, his hands raised in surrender, facing the unseen photographer. The camera had captured his face in perfect clarity, young, scared, but somehow defiant. The lab fell silent as Claire pulled up the final frame. Half the image was black, as if taken accidentally, but in the visible portion, a gloved hand reached toward the lens. The angle suggested the camera had been knocked away or grabbed. "Whoever took this?" Claire's voice was barely above a whisper. "He didn't walk away." Henri stared at the sequence, his historian's mind assembling the narrative. Fletcher had stumbled onto something in those woods, perhaps a hidden German position, maybe an escape route for SS officers fleeing Allied advances. He documented it, not knowing it would cost him his life. "I need to make some calls," Claire said, reaching for her phone. "The Defense POW MIA accounting agency needs to see these immediately. This changes everything about Fletcher's case." While Claire contacted the authorities, Henri gathered his coat and the envelope containing copies of the photos. He needed air, needed to process what they'd discovered. Outside, Paris rain fell in heavy sheets, turning the streets into mirrors of lamplight. Thunder rolled across the city as Henri stood under the building's awning, staring at the final photo in his hands. A flash of lightning split the sky, illuminating the image for a fraction of a second. In that brief electric moment, the blurred figure seemed to stare back at Henri through the decades. A ghost caught between the shutter's click and eternity. The thunder that followed felt like an echo of that long-ago morning when a young soldier with a camera witnessed something he was never meant to see. Henri carefully tucked the photo away, protecting it from the rain. After 79 years, Ray Fletcher's last roll of film had finally been developed, but the truth it revealed was darker than anyone could have imagined. More thunder growled overhead as Henri stepped into the rain, leaving the lab and its ghosts behind. The investigation was about to begin. The morning fog clung to Oradour-sur-Vézère like a shroud as military vehicles rolled into the village. Local residents peered through curtained windows at the procession: French gendarmerie vans, a forensics truck, and 2 black SUVs, bearing U.S. government plates. The convoy wound its way up the dirt road toward Henri's property, where yellow crime scene tape now cordoned off the barn. Henri stood waiting by his front gate, wrapped in a wool coat against the autumn chill. The first SUV stopped, and a broad-shouldered man in civilian clothes stepped out. He carried himself with military bearing despite his plain attire. "Professor Lemoyne?" The American extended his hand. "Major Thomas Ellis, Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. Thank you for waiting for us." Henri shook the offered hand, noting the firm grip and analytical gaze. "Of course, though I wish we were meeting under better circumstances." Ellis nodded, his expression professionally neutral. "Your discovery changes everything we thought we knew about Private Fletcher's disappearance. We'll need to document everything exactly as you found it." More vehicles arrived, disgorging a mix of French and American personnel. Equipment was unloaded: ground-penetrating radar units, forensic lighting, cameras, and excavation tools. Ellis directed the setup with quiet efficiency while consulting a tablet. "We've assembled joint teams," he explained to Henri. "French military historians, our forensic specialists, and local law enforcement. Given the potential implications, we're treating this as both a recovery operation and a war crimes investigation." Henri led Ellis toward the barn, their boots crunching on frost-covered gravel. "I've gathered all the property records I could find," he said. "The deed transfers, renovation permits, everything back to 1940. Inside the barn, work lights cast harsh shadows across the partially excavated floor. The ammo box's discovery site had been marked and photographed with numbered evidence flags dotting the surrounding area. Ellis studied the scene, making notes. "Show me exactly where you found it," he said. Henri pointed to a section of disturbed earth near the eastern wall. "Under those stones. The metal detector signal was strongest there." Ellis knelt, running a gloved hand over the packed dirt. "And the cellar entrance?" "We haven't located it yet. The original blueprints show one, but—" Henri gestured at the solid floor. "Let's change that." Ellis stood and waved over a technician with ground-penetrating radar equipment. "Full scan, 5-centimeter intervals. I want to know what's under every inch of this floor." The morning progressed into afternoon as teams methodically documented the site. Henri watched Ellis work, noting how the major's initial military stiffness gave way to focused intensity. This wasn't just another case to him. Around 2 o'clock, Ellis called Henri over to a folding table where he'd spread out several maps. "Professor, take a look at this." The maps showed aerial surveys of the region from different years: 1944, 1945, and 1946. Ellis pointed to their location. Notice anything strange? Henri leaned closer, adjusting his glasses. The farmhouse appeared, clearly on the 1944 map, but in the later surveys, the area was marked as empty pasture. It's been erased, he said slowly. Exactly. Ellis pulled out another document. This is from Allied intelligence archives. In late 1944, they were tracking German officer movements through this area. One name keeps appearing, Hauptmann Karl Weiss, SS Totenkopf Division. The death's head units, Henry murmured. They were notorious for executions, Ellis finished grimly. And according to these reports, Weiss was using a secured location for interrogating captured Allied personnel. A commotion near the radar equipment interrupted them. A technician was calling Ellis over, pointing at his screen. Sir, we've found something. There's a void space below, about 2 meters down. Looks like a room. Ellis quickly organized an excavation team. As workers carefully removed sections of the stone floor, Henri retreated to his office to search through local records. He returned an hour later to find Ellis speaking with an elderly woman, Marie Dubois, the local archive clerk. Monsieur Lemoine, she greeted him. I was just telling the major about the stories my father used to tell, about this place during the war. Ellis's expression was tight. Madame Dubois says there were rumors about German officers coming and going at night. Trucks with covered beds. Screams that people pretended not to hear. They called it Le Tombeau, the tomb, Marie said softly. After liberation, no one would go near it. The family who bought it in '49 sealed everything below ground, said they wanted to forget. A shout from the barn drew their attention. The excavation had broken through to a hollow space beneath the floor. Cool, stale air wafted up from the darkness as workers set up powerful lights. Ellis pulled on protective gear and descended the newly exposed stairs, Henri close behind. The beam of their flashlights cut through decades of undisturbed darkness, revealing a concrete-lined chamber about 15 feet square. The air was thick with the musty smell of decay. There, Ellis said quietly, pointing to the far corner. Human bones lay crumpled against the wall, still partially clothed in rotting fabric. The skeleton was positioned as if the person had been sitting, head slumped forward. Rusted dog tags glinted at the neck. The boots, American-issue combat boots, were still laced. Forensic technicians carefully photographed and documented the scene. As they worked, Ellis directed his light toward the wall behind the remains. A single bullet hole marred the concrete, dark with old blood. The angle suggests execution style, Ellis said clinically, though his voice had gone slightly hoarse. Close range, probably while kneeling. Henri watched as the technicians gently lifted the remains onto a special frame for transport. The bones seemed so small, so fragile, hard to believe they had once been a young man full of life and hope. Ellis stood beside him, in the dim light, his professional mask slipping for just a moment. He didn't just vanish, the major murmured. He was buried alive in history. A technician approached with something cupped in gloved hands, a single bullet extracted from the skull. The physical evidence of Fletcher's final moment glinted dully under the forensic lights, a small piece of metal that had ended one life and haunted countless others. The town hall's conference room hummed with the soft whir of a digital projector. Blinds drawn against the gathering dusk, Henri and Major Ellis sat before a makeshift screen where Ray Fletcher's last photographs loomed large, each image a window into November 1944. Outside, reporters' voices carried through the ancient stone walls. Word of the discovery had spread quickly in the small community. Local journalists huddled near the entrance, trading theories and waiting for official statements. Start from the beginning, Ellis directed, his voice tight with focus. The technician clicked through the first frames. Muddy forest paths, morning fog hanging between bare trees. Then came the strange carved symbol, now clearly visible as the SS Totenkopf Death's Head rune. He was documenting evidence, Henri observed, leaning forward. Look how methodical the shots are. He knew something was wrong. Ellis nodded, making notes. A reconnaissance scout with a photographer's eye, perfect combination for witnessing what he wasn't supposed to see. The next image showed Ray himself, captured in what must have been a timer shot. He stood at the edge of a clearing, turned half away from the camera. His expression was alert, worried, a man who sensed danger but hadn't yet fully grasped its scale. Timestamp puts this at 08:47 hours, Ellis said, about an hour before his scheduled radio check-in. The sequence continued. The farmhouse emerging from morning mist, boot prints in mud leading to the barn door, then that crucial frame, the German officer emerging from what they now knew was the cellar entrance. Henri adjusted his glasses, studying the uniform details. The insignia, see it there? SS Hauptsturmführer rank patches, and that unit patch. Totenkopf Division, Ellis confirmed grimly. Elite SS units, known for executing prisoners and resistance fighters. He pulled out a file. This matches intelligence reports about Hauptmann Weiss operating in the area. Local collaborators probably helped hide him during the German retreat. The next image hit them both hard. Ray with his hands raised, the camera obviously dropped or set down, catching him in profile. His face showed recognition of what was coming. He knew, Henri said softly. He understood what he'd found. The final frame was a blur of motion, that gloved hand reaching toward the lens, presumably the last thing Ray saw before. Ellis stopped the projection, letting out a slow breath. The timeline fits. Allied command received reports about executions in these woods, but they buried them. He spread several declassified documents across the table. Look at this field intelligence memo from December 44. Henri read aloud. Local claims of SS activities near Oradour-sur-Vézère deemed unsubstantiated. Investigation not recommended given upcoming offensive preparations. He looked up. The Battle of the Bulge. They couldn't risk undermining morale, Ellis said. So they let it go, let him go. A knock at the door interrupted them. Claire Durret, the photo restoration expert, entered with a fresh set of prints. We've enhanced the final sequence, she said. Used new software to pull more detail from the shadows. They gathered around as she laid out the images. The enhancement revealed new details. A wedding ring on the officer's hand, a distinctive scar along his jaw, the particular way he held his Luger. Wait, Ellis grabbed a magnifying glass. That ring, I've seen it before. He rifled through the evidence photos from the barn excavation, pulling out a shot of a small object found near the remains. A tarnished silver ring, engraved with an oak leaf pattern. Trophy taking, Henri said darkly. Common practice among SS units. Ellis was already on his phone, calling the forensics team. But before he could speak, Henri's cell phone buzzed. Unknown number. Allô? Henri answered. A voice spoke in rapid French, tone cold and warning. Some graves should stay closed, Professor. Old wounds still bleed in Oradour. Think of your safety. Think of your reputation. The line went dead. Henri slowly lowered the phone, face pale. What was that? Ellis asked sharply. A friendly suggestion to stop asking questions. Henri managed a weak smile. It seems not everyone appreciates historical accuracy. Ellis's expression hardened. We'll trace the call. Get you protection if needed. But Henri was already turning back to the photos, studying the officer's partially visible face with new intensity. Non, he said firmly. I owe this soldier the truth. Someone buried him in silence once. I won't do it again. They worked late into the night, cross-referencing military records with local documents. The pieces began fitting together. Reports of trucks moving at night, requisitioned fuel logs, civilian complaints that vanished from official records. A pattern of deliberate oversight emerged, the kind that only happened when people chose not to see. Around midnight, Henri sat alone in his study, the last enhanced photo printed and pinned above his desk. The officer's face lurked in the corner of the frame, partially obscured but unmistakably human. A face that had ordered death, then vanished into the fabric of post-war reconstruction. The wind picked up outside, rattling the barn's old shutters with a hollow wooden clatter. Henri stared at the photo, at the face of evil wearing a wedding ring, and wondered how many other secrets lay buried in Oradour's soil. Behind him, the barn creaked and settled, its timbers still holding decades of silence. But now, at least, one voice was speaking again. Through silver halide and celluloid, through bone and bullet, through the patient lens of time. Ray Fletcher's final testimony was developing at last. Through the window, Henri could see the barn's dark outline against the night sky. The yellow crime scene tape fluttered in the breeze like nervous whispers. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, the sound echoing off ancient stones that had witnessed too much and said too little. The desk lamp cast Henri's shadow across the photograph, merging with the image of that long-ago morning when a young American soldier had seen too much and paid with his life. The officer's face stared back, a ghost exposed by chemistry and light, by patience and persistence. The desk lamp cast harsh shadows across the photograph pinned above Henri's desk. The enhanced image, now blown up to reveal previously hidden details, showed the Nazi officer's face with unsettling clarity. What had been a blur of motion and shadow now resolved into distinct features: high cheekbones, a thin mouth, eyes that seemed to stare through time directly at the viewer. Henri traced the edge of the print with trembling fingers. After decades of darkness, this man's face had emerged from chemical baths and digital scans to confront the present. The complex restoration process had taken weeks, with Claire working late into the nights, coaxing detail from the degraded emulsion. Major Ellis strode into the office, carrying a thick manila folder stamped with various security clearance markers. Claire followed, clutching her laptop. "The enhancement algorithms finally finished processing," Claire said, setting up her computer. "We can now match about 80% of the facial features to known SS identification photos." Ellis spread several black and white photographs across Henri's desk. They showed military personnel in crisp uniforms, their faces catalogued with German efficiency. "These are from captured Wehrmacht personnel files," he explained, cross-referenced with our database of known Totenkopf division officers operating in the region. Claire pulled up the enhanced photo alongside the military ID shots. Her software began highlighting points of comparison: the angle of the jaw, the set of the eyes, the distinctive scar. "There," Ellis said suddenly, jabbing his finger at one particular SS identification card. "Hauptmann Karl Weiss, Intelligence Division, attached to Totenkopf units during the German retreat from northern France." Henri studied the two images side by side. The resemblance was unmistakable. "What do we know about him?" Ellis opened his folder. Weiss was a rising star in SS intelligence. Educated at Leipzig, recruited early into the Nazi Party. He specialized in counter-resistance operations, hunting down Allied agents and resistance networks. He paused, letting the implications sink in. "Last confirmed. Sighting was during the fall of Metz in late 1944. After that, he simply vanished." "Like so many others," Henri murmured. "Not quite." Ellis pulled out another document, this one marked with CIA letterhead. "This was declassified last year. Operation Paperclip files plus related Crowcast records." He spread the papers across the desk. "Weiss didn't just disappear. He was helped." Claire leaned in, scanning the documents. "The rat lines," she said. "The escape routes." Ellis nodded. Nazi officials, especially those with valuable intelligence, were smuggled out of Europe through various channels. Some went to South America, others— He tapped a particular memo. "Some stayed closer to home, hidden in plain sight." Henri picked up the document. It was a surveillance report dated 1957, detailing the movements of a French businessman named Lucien Marchand in Lyon. Certain phrases jumped out. "Suspected to be Weiss under deep cover," and "Asset provides ongoing intelligence value regarding Soviet operations." "They protected him," Henri said, his voice tight with disbelief. "The Allies knew who he was and protected him." "The Cold War was beginning," Ellis explained grimly. "Former Nazi intelligence officers with anti-communist expertise became valuable assets. Weiss apparently traded information for a new identity, complete with documentation, business connections, even a family." Claire pulled up local records on her laptop. "Lucien Marchand appears in Lyon's business registry in 1946. Import-export company, very respectable. He married a French woman in 1947, had a son in 1955. She looked up. "The company still exists, now run by the son, André Marchand." Henri felt a chill. "So this man, this Nazi officer who likely executed Ray Fletcher, he just started over? Became a respected businessman? Raised a family?" "That's what we thought," Ellis said, "until we dug deeper." He produced another document, this one a recent DNA analysis. "We obtained a sample from André Marchand through unofficial channels, compared it to genetic markers from Weiss's surviving relatives in Germany." He paused. "No match. André Marchand was not Karl Weiss's biological son." Silence filled the room as the implications sank in. Claire was the first to speak. "So either Marchand's wife had an affair, Or Lucien Marchand was never really married to her at all, Ellis finished. Just another layer of the cover identity. Someone else raised that child. Someone who needed to appear as normal as possible while hiding from war crimes charges. Henri stared at the photo of Weiss Marchand's gravesite, a respectable plot in a Lyon cemetery, dated 1976. The headstone showed a man who had lived a full life, died peacefully in his bed, respected by his community. Nothing about the simple marker suggested the darkness in his past. "We need to speak with the son," Henri said finally. "This André Marchand. What does he know about his father's true identity?" Ellis gathered the documents, his movements precise and controlled. "That's our next step, but carefully. If André Marchand has spent his whole life believing one story about his father, he deserves to know the truth," Henri insisted. "The truth?" Claire asked softly. "Or justice?" Ellis checked his watch. "The Lyon office opens in 3 hours. I've already arranged an interview with André Marchand." He looked at Henri. "Are you ready to tell a man his entire life might be built on a war criminal's lies?" Henri glanced once more at the enhanced photograph, at Weiss's cold eyes staring out from that long-ago morning. Ray Fletcher had died to expose this truth. The least they could do was see it through. "Let's go to Lyon," Henri said, standing up. "It's time to close this circle." They drove through the pre-dawn darkness, the highway empty except for occasional trucks. In Henri's briefcase, the photograph seemed to pulse with its terrible secret, the face of a man who had escaped justice through calculated deception, who had built a new life on the foundation of others' deaths. The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when they pulled into Lyon. They parked near the Marchand Import-Export offices, a well-maintained building in the business district. A light already burned in an upper window despite the early hour. Ellis checked his weapon discreetly, a habit of caution rather than immediate threat. Claire adjusted her recording equipment. Henri simply held the photograph, the weight of decades of silence heavy in his hands. As they approached the building's entrance, Henri spotted a tall, austere man with thin white hair unlocking the front door. André Marchand, the son of a ghost, raised by a shadow. He turned at their footsteps, his pale eyes showing no emotion as Ellis displayed his credentials. In that moment, looking at André's controlled features, Henri saw an echo of the photograph upstairs in his office. The same careful blankness that came from carrying secrets too long in silence. The Marchand Import-Export office occupied 3 floors of a well-maintained stone building in Lyon's business district. Brass letters on frosted glass announced the company name, a respectable facade hiding decades of secrets. André Marchand's corner office overlooked the quiet street below, its walls lined with maritime certificates and trade agreements. Everything spoke of legitimacy, order, and careful documentation. Major Ellis set his briefcase on the polished conference table while Claire arranged her laptop and recording equipment. Henri remained standing, watching André Marchand's face as the businessman settled into his leather chair. There was something unsettling about his composure, too practiced, too controlled. "This is harassment," Marchand said flatly. "My father was a respected member of this community for 30 years. Whatever war stories you're chasing died with him." Ellis removed the enhanced photograph from his briefcase, sliding it across the table. "Your father died in 1976, according to official records, but the man in this image, Hauptmann Karl Weiss, was supposedly killed during the fall of Metz in 1944. He paused. "Except he wasn't killed, was he? He became Lucien Marchand." André barely glanced at the photo. "My father was French, born in Vichy. These accusations are absurd." "We have DNA evidence," Claire interjected quietly, turning her laptop to show the genetic analysis. "You're not biologically related to Lucien Marchand. Or should I say, Karl Weiss?" Something flickered behind André's eyes, a crack in the perfect mask. He stared at the DNA results for a long moment, his fingers drumming softly on the desk. When he looked up, his expression had changed. The defensive facade melted away, replaced by an eerie calm that was somehow more disturbing. "Genetics," he said softly. "The ultimate betrayal of blood." He gave a thin smile. "You've done your homework, Major Ellis. But do you understand what you're really uncovering?" Henri stepped forward. "We know your father was SS, an intelligence officer who escaped justice by assuming a false identity. We know he was here in November 1944 when Private First Class Raymond Fletcher disappeared. Disappeared? Andre's laugh was cold and brittle. Is that the sanitized term you're using? He stood and walked to the window, his reflection ghostly in the morning light. My childhood was precisely arranged. No photographs in the house. They could reveal too much, he said. No questions about the war years. No discussions of politics or history. He turned back to face them. Do you know what it's like to be raised by a man who flinches at camera flashes? Who checks every room for surveillance devices? Who makes you memorize escape routes before bedtime stories? Ellis exchanged glances with Henri. They were finally breaking through. When did you learn the truth? Ellis asked. After his death. I was executing his will, clearing out his private study. Andre's voice remained eerily detached. Behind a false panel in his desk, I found documents, SS identification papers, Allied uniform patches, a journal written in German, his real mother tongue, not the perfect French he'd trained himself to speak. He paused. And a letter, just one page, but it explained everything. What did it say? Henri pressed. It was an apology of sorts, written in German, regrets for what had to be done. But not regret for the acts themselves, only that they had become necessary. Andre's lips twisted. He believed until the end that he'd served a greater purpose, that eliminating threats to the Reich was a sacred duty even after Berlin fell. Ellis leaned forward. Threats like Raymond Fletcher? Your American scout wasn't just in the wrong place at the wrong time, Andre said. He was part of something larger. My father's unit. They had a specific mission. Intelligence gathering was becoming crucial as the Allies advanced. They needed to know what evidence remained of certain activities. War crimes, Henri said flatly. Andre shrugged. The Reich was crumbling. Records needed to be destroyed, witnesses silenced. Scout patrols like Fletcher's. They were gathering proof of atrocities, documentation that could have exposed not just crimes, but the networks that enabled them. The French civilians who collaborated, the businesses that profited, the officials who looked the other way. Ellis felt a chill as the pieces clicked together. Fletcher's execution wasn't random. It was systematic, part of a larger SS operation to intercept Allied intelligence gathering. Very good, Major. Andre's smile didn't reach his eyes. My father's particular skills made him valuable to both sides after the war. The Americans wanted his intelligence on Soviet operations. The French needed his silence about wartime collaboration. So they gave him a new name, a business license, and a chance to build a respectable life. He gestured around the office. All this, built on buried bodies and convenient amnesia. Why didn't you come forward? Henri demanded. When you found those documents, you must have known. Known what? Andre's voice turned sharp. That exposing the truth would unravel not just my life, but dozens of others? That the comfortable myths of resistance and liberation would crumble? He shook his head. The war never ended for us, Monsieur Lemoine. It just went underground. The old networks didn't die. They adapted. They're still here, watching, protecting their interests. Ellis studied Andre's face. Are you protecting those interests now? Is that why you're finally talking? I'm talking because it doesn't matter anymore. The principals are dead. The money's been laundered clean. And the only ones left are dying old men and their ignorant children. Andre returned to his chair. My father taught me one true thing. Secrets are like radiation. They poison slowly, across generations. Henri placed Fletcher's recovered camera on the desk. This secret is finished poisoning. We're bringing him home. Home? Andre laughed softly. The dead don't have homes, Monsieur Lemoine. They have consequences, and you're about to unleash 79 years of them. Ellis gathered their materials while Claire stopped the recording. As they prepared to leave, Andre spoke again. Major Ellis, when you write your report, remember, my father wasn't a monster. He was something far more dangerous, a bureaucrat who believed in order above humanity. The real evil isn't in the killing, it's in the filing systems that make killing routine. They left the office in silence, stepping into the morning sun. As they walked toward their car, Henri caught movement across the street. A man raising a camera, its lens glinting as it captured their images. Henri froze mid-step. They're still watching. he whispered. Ellis followed his gaze, but the photographer had already melted into the morning crowd, leaving only questions in his wake. The restoration lab in Paris hummed with the soft whir of equipment. Claire Duret hunched over her workstation, carefully adjusting the infrared scanner settings. Her eyes burned from hours of staring at nearly invisible variations in the degraded film's surface. The last roll from Ray Fletcher's camera had yielded its horrors frame by frame, but one exposure remained, previously dismissed as blank, damaged beyond recovery. "There's something here," she muttered, more to herself than to Henri, who sat nearby reviewing archives on his laptop. "The chemical structure is different from true blank film." She adjusted the contrast again, watching the computer screen as layers of digital enhancement stripped away decades of decay. A ghost began to emerge from the darkness, first as abstract shapes, then resolving into something more concrete. "Henri," she called softly, "come look at this." He moved to stand behind her chair as she pointed to the screen. "See here? There's a figure in the tree line. The angle suggests this was taken moments before or after the surrender photo." Henri leaned closer, squinting at the faint silhouette. "Can you enhance it further?" Claire's fingers moved across the keyboard, applying additional filtering. The image clarified slightly, enough to reveal a man in civilian clothing watching the scene unfold. His stance suggested familiarity with the terrain, comfortable in his concealment. "Those clothes," Henri said. "That's a French civilian. The cut of the jacket. It's typical of what resistance members wore." "But why would resistance be watching and not intervening?" Claire asked, her voice tight with concern. "Unless they weren't resistance at all." Henri straightened, his expression grim. "We need to check the regional archives again, focus on local civilian collaborators who were never prosecuted." The next morning found Henri at the departmental archives in Limoges, surrounded by dusty boxes of wartime records. His fingers moved methodically through yellowed papers, scanning endless lists of names and dates. Hours passed before he found it. A field report from early 1945, written by an American counterintelligence officer. The document mentioned a French civilian informant who had aided SS operations in the Oradour region. The man had provided intelligence on Allied movements and helped identify potential resistance networks. But unlike other collaborators who faced swift justice after liberation, this one had somehow escaped prosecution. Henri's breath caught as he read the name, Etienne Broussard. Further digging revealed that Broussard had been a prominent landowner in the area. His property holdings included several farms, including the very building where Ray Fletcher's remains were found. Yet after the war, Broussard had not only avoided arrest but had been celebrated. Local newspapers praised him as a resistance supporter who had protected the region's interests during occupation. "Protected what?" Henri muttered, copying down dates and locations. "And from whom?" The answers began to emerge in the village itself. Henri spent days interviewing elderly residents, most of whom initially claimed no memory of those years. But one afternoon, in a small house on the outskirts of town, he met Madame Lucette Moreau. At 96, Lucette's body was frail, but her mind remained sharp. She sat in her worn armchair, hands trembling slightly as she held the cup of tea her granddaughter had prepared. When Henri mentioned Broussard's name, something flickered in her pale blue eyes. "You've found something about the American, haven't you?" she asked quietly. Henri nodded, careful to keep his voice gentle. "We found his camera and his remains." Lucette closed her eyes briefly. "God forgive us," she whispered. "We knew, not all of us, but enough. We knew what happened in that cellar. Why didn't anyone come forward?" "You don't understand what it was like after liberation," she said. "Everyone was desperate to prove they had resisted. The purges were beginning. People accused of collaboration were being arrested, beaten, executed. Etienne Broussard, he wasn't just wealthy. He knew things about everyone. Who had traded with the Germans, who had given information, who had looked the other way." She set down her teacup with shaking hands. "Broussard wasn't a hero. He chose survival, and he made sure others chose it too. When that American soldier stumbled onto something he shouldn't have seen," she trailed off, her voice catching. "What did Fletcher see?" Henri pressed gently. "A meeting," Lucette said, "between SS officers and local officials. They were destroying records, planning escape routes. Broussard was their contact. He knew all the safe houses, all the hiding places. When the American was caught photographing them..." She shook her head. "Broussard convinced everyone it was necessary. For survival. For protection. And after the war?" He became untouchable. He had evidence against too many important people. So they made him a hero instead, gave him medals, named streets after him. And we buried the truth along with that poor boy. Tears slid down her weathered cheeks. My husband wanted to tell the Americans where to look, but Broussard visited us one night. He said if we spoke, our children would pay the price. So we stayed silent, like cowards. You were protecting your family, Henri said softly. Perhaps. But that boy had a family too, didn't he? Someone who waited for him to come home. Henri nodded, thinking of Margaret's decades of unanswered letters. Yes, someone waited. Lucette reached for his hand with surprising strength. Then tell their story. All of it. Broussard died thinking he'd won, that his lies would outlive him. Show the world what kind of hero he really was. The next morning, Henri stood before Broussard's grave in the village cemetery. The headstone was impressive, white marble carved with flowing script. Etienne Broussard, 1899 to 1989. Patriot, protector, survivor. Henri removed the enhanced photograph from his pocket, the image of the hidden figure watching Ray Fletcher's final moments. Carefully, he placed it at the base of the headstone. No more lies, he whispered. In the distance, church bells began to toll, their deep resonance rolling across the valley like echoes from another time. Henri turned and walked away, leaving the truth to speak for itself at last. The autumn morning dawned clear and crisp over Arlington National Cemetery. Rows of white headstones stretched endlessly across the rolling hills, each one catching the early light. A military transport plane had landed at dawn, carrying precious cargo. The flag-draped coffin of Private First Class Raymond Fletcher finally returned after 79 years. Honor guards moved with practiced precision, their white gloves and pressed uniforms immaculate as they transferred the casket from the hearse. Diana Fletcher, Ray's daughter, born after his disappearance and now 73 years old, stood straight-backed despite her age. She watched the procession with her mother Margaret's quiet dignity, though Margaret herself had passed 5 years earlier, never knowing this day would come. The morning air carried the scent of fresh-cut grass and late roses. A small crowd gathered near the gravesite, military officials, historians, local media, and what remained of the Fletcher family. Henri Lemoine stood slightly apart, his silver hair catching the sunlight, the restored Leica camera held carefully in his hands. Beside him, Major Ellis adjusted his dress uniform, index cards with his eulogy tucked into his breast pocket. Diana's daughter, Avery, a documentary filmmaker in her early 40s, moved quietly through the crowd with her camera. She captured the sun glinting off polished brass buttons, the gentle ripple of flags in the breeze, the solemn faces of veterans who had come to honor one of their own. Through her lens, she saw what her grandfather might have seen, the power of small moments frozen in time. The chaplain stepped forward as the honor guard positioned the casket, his words carried across the hallowed ground. We gather today to lay to rest Private First Class Raymond Fletcher, who gave his life in service to his country. Major Ellis rose next, squaring his shoulders as he approached the podium. His voice was steady, measured, as he began to speak. 79 years ago, a young man from Minnesota vanished into the forests of occupied France. He carried with him a camera, not a weapon, but a tool to document truth. Through that lens, Private Fletcher bore witness to both humanity's capacity for darkness and its resilience in the face of evil. Ellis paused, glancing at the recovered camera Henri now held. The photographs Private Fletcher took in his final hours tell us what official records could not. They show us a soldier who, even in the face of mortal danger, remained committed to exposing truth. His last images reveal not just the circumstances of his death, but the moral courage that defined his life. The major detailed the sequence of photographs, the strange symbols carved in trees, the hidden figures, the final confrontation. With each description, the gathered mourners seemed to lean forward, as if trying to peer through time itself. Private Fletcher didn't simply disappear, Ellis continued. He was silenced because he saw what others wanted buried. But even in death, he found a way to speak. His camera, hidden away by those who feared its testimony, survived to tell his story. Henri stepped forward then, carefully placing the restored Leica on a small display table near the casket. The morning light caught its cleaned metal surface, making it gleam like new despite its decades underground. Avery's camera focused on it, recording this reunion of witness and warrior. Diana approached the podium next, her hands trembling slightly as she held a weathered piece of paper, a fragment from Ray's journal preserved in the ammo box with his camera. The military official standing beside her spoke with quiet reverence. These words were among the last Private Fletcher wrote. They were found with his effects, preserved as if waiting to be heard. He began to read, "If I don't come back, tell them we saw things men shouldn't carry alone." A hushed silence fell over the gathering. In that moment, the weight of history, of secrets kept and truths revealed, seemed to press down on every shoulder. The honor guard raised their rifles. 3 volleys cracked across the morning air, startling birds from nearby trees. A bugler stepped forward, raising his instrument to sound taps. The mournful notes floated across Arlington's sacred ground, echoing off marble and granite. Diana accepted the crisply folded flag, pressing it close to her heart as tears slid silently down her cheeks. Avery captured it all through her lens, understanding now why her grandfather had chosen to document rather than look away. A warm breeze stirred the autumn air, lifting one of the photographs that had been displayed during the service. The first frame from Ray's final roll of film. It showed a sunrise over the French countryside, taken just hours before his encounter with destiny. The photo danced briefly in the wind before settling gently onto the grass, image facing skyward. In that captured moment from 1944, light spilled across distant hills much like it did now over Arlington's endless rows of white stones. Through the preserved image, Ray Fletcher's last dawn reached across time to touch his final homecoming. The bugler's last note faded into silence. Private First Class Raymond Fletcher was home at last, his witness complete, his story finally told. Winter sunlight filtered through the high windows of the Musée de la Photographie in Paris, casting long shadows across polished floors. Inside a newly installed exhibit titled Witnesses of War, visitors moved in hushed reverence between displays of combat photography spanning decades of conflict. But one case drew particular attention, a simple glass cube containing a weathered Leica third camera, its metal surface bearing the subtle scars of time buried beneath French soil. The brass plaque beneath it read simply, "Recovered 2023. Testimony from 1944. Next to the camera lay 3 prints from its final roll of film, carefully preserved and mounted. The carved tree, the blurred surrender, the reaching hand. Each image was accompanied by detailed notes explaining their significance in solving a 79-year-old mystery. Claire Duray, who had helped restore the camera's precious cargo, often found herself drawn back to this display during her lunch breaks. Today she watched as an elderly American couple lingered before the case, the woman wiping away tears as she read the story of Private Fletcher's last moments. Similar scenes had played out daily since the exhibit opened, people from all walks of life connecting with this tangible piece of hidden history. In Lyon's historic Lumière Institute, the premiere of The Forgotten Frame drew a capacity crowd. Avery Fletcher's documentary opened with the gentle whir of her grandfather's recovered camera advancing film, followed by stark images of the Oradour farmhouse as it stood today. Henri Lemoine's voice carried over the footage, describing that first morning when his metal detector had sparked against buried truth. The film masterfully wove together archival footage, interviews, and Ray's recovered photographs. When it reached the sequence of his final moments, the theater fell so silent you could hear people holding their breath. The blurred image of Hauptmann Karl Weiss filled the screen as Henri and Major Ellis explained how the SS officer had hidden in plain sight after the war, protected by a web of silence and convenience. But it was the testimony of elderly villagers that proved most devastating. Men and women in their 90s, speaking on camera for the first time, described the atmosphere of fear and complicity that had allowed war criminals to slip away into new lives. One woman, her hands trembling as she spoke, revealed how her own father had helped maintain Etienne Broussard's cover story about being a resistance hero. "We built our peace on buried bones," she said, her eyes full of decades-old shame, and called it survival. The documentary's impact was immediate and far-reaching. In Washington, the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency announced a review of other unresolved World War II disappearances in the region. French media outlets began investigating other cases of possible post-war collaboration that had been quietly forgotten. In Ordre-sur-Vézère, the municipal council faced mounting pressure to rename streets and buildings honoring supposed resistance figures now revealed to have darker histories. The Avenue Étienne Broussard became Rue Raymond Fletcher, though the change sparked heated debates about historical memory and the complex nature of truth. Yet questions continued to haunt Henri and the investigation team. The final photograph, the one showing the gloved hand reaching for the camera, presented a particular puzzle. If Ray had already been detained, who had taken that last exposure? And more importantly, why had they preserved the evidence rather than destroying it? During a panel discussion following the Lyon premiere, Henri addressed these questions directly. We believe someone else was present that day, someone who chose to document rather than participate in the crime. Perhaps a conscript who'd had enough or a resistance member who'd infiltrated the German unit. Whoever it was, they made sure the camera survived. He held up an enlarged print of the final frame. This isn't just a photograph. It's a message in a bottle, sent across time. Someone wanted the truth to survive, even if justice couldn't come in their lifetime. Major Ellis, sitting beside Henri on the panel, nodded in agreement. The camera wasn't just recording events. It was recording conscience. Someone looked through that viewfinder and chose to preserve evidence of a crime their own side committed. That took tremendous moral courage. The investigation had revealed other subtle signs of this unknown witness. The careful way the camera had been wrapped and sealed in the ammunition box. The deliberate placement in a location that would eventually be discovered. Even the choice to hide rather than bury it suggested someone wanted it found, eventually. They turned Ray's camera into both evidence and testimony, Henri explained to the audience. They couldn't save his life, but they could save his truth. Weeks after the documentary's premiere, Henri returned alone to the Oradour farmhouse site. The property had been designated a historical landmark, with markers explaining its significance to visitors. The collapsed barn had been partially restored as an exhibition space, its infamous cellar preserved behind glass as a reminder of darker days. The morning air was crisp with early frost as Henri followed the trail into the surrounding woods. Fallen leaves crunched beneath his feet, the same path Ray Fletcher had walked that November morning in 1944. Though the forest had changed in 79 years, certain landmarks remained stubbornly constant. He found the old oak tree easily enough, its trunk now wider but still bearing the carved SS Death's Head symbol, though split and weathered by decades of growth. Henri ran his fingers over the rough bark, feeling the deeper grooves where someone's knife had carved meaning into living wood. But there was something new. Below the Nazi symbol, recently carved with careful precision, were 4 simple words. Truth waits in the dark. Henri touched the fresh inscription, wondering who had added this coda to history's long sentence. Perhaps it was one of the villagers, finally unburdening themselves of inherited guilt. Or maybe a visitor moved by Ray's story, leaving their own small marker of witness. The forest stood silent around him, no longer keeping its secrets but simply holding them in trust, like the camera had done, like the unknown photographer had done, like all those who choose to preserve truth rather than bury it. Henri took one last look at the carved tree, then turned and walked away, leaving the woods to their eternal watch. Behind him, the morning sun filtered through bare branches, casting dappled light across the bark where old wounds and new words testified to the patience of buried truth.